Good morning. Okay, so let's get started. Today we're going to be discussing a case, and we're going to sort of draw out what we know about the case and kind of see if we can pick apart its pieces and wrap our head around the principles that it contains. And then if there's time, we'll sort of expand the lens and think about something a little bit larger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the case. I'm going to give you guys a minute to get yourself organized, find your notes, find your, your text, or Google the case, or whatever you want to do, and then we're going to discuss the case. So here's the case. I'm going to put it in the chat for you guys. It's Walsh versus Lonsdale, 1882. Okay, so take a minute, find your stuff, get yourself ready, and we will take it from there. I will tell you guys, I actually think that the Wikipedia article about this case is not bad. So you should feel free to go and look at that. Good morning, Johnny. So for the latecomers, I just want to let you know we are going to be discussing the case of Walsh versus Lonsdale. And right now, I'm giving you guys just a minute to sort of get materials together and get yourself ready to have that conversation. So that's why things are quiet, and we'll start our conversation in just a second. Okay, so let's get started. And the first thing that we want to do is I'd like to discuss the facts of the case, okay? So what I'm interested in when I say the facts of the case, I mean, what's the story that brings these two parties to the courthouse door? So tell me about, how their relationship started, and take me all the way through up to the point where they're ready to file the lawsuit, okay? So anybody who wants to jump in, go ahead.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, Michaela, go ahead.
So essentially, the defendant, which is Lonsdale, agreed to grant the claimant, which is Walsh, a lease of a mill for 7 years. The rent was to be paid quarterly in arrears, with a year's rent payable in advance if demanded. The parties did not execute a deed for the grant of the tenancy, but the claimant moved in and paid rent quarterly in arrears. The defendant then demanded a year's rent in advance, and the claimant refused to pay. The claimant argued that under common law, oh wait,
No, no.
well,
The
yeah,
claimant's argument does not
I'll
matter
stop.
yet. That's what they said in the lawsuit. So
Yeah, okay, no problem.
so everything you said up to that point,
Yeah,
absolutely correct, right? Absolutely correct. Spot on. Okay.
okay.
But so Lonsdale demands a year's rent in advance, which the contract says he has the right to demand. Walsh says no. What does Lonsdale do? Okay, so Michaela walked us.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
it says that Mr. Lonsdale demanded payment in advance and levied distress for non-payment of rent.
Right. Okay, so Gabrielle, let me just walk you through the sequence of events, right? We had a contract for a lease that recites the necessity of a deed. The deed is never executed. The process continues to the relationship continues for a couple of years. Sorry, something came in on my other computer that distracted me for a second. The relationship goes on for a couple of years, and then Lonsdale comes along and makes this demand for a year's payment in advance. He's entitled to do that under the contract. Walsh says, no, screw you, buddy. So Lonsdale distrains Walsh's goods. And what does that mean in this context? And the noun form, by the way, like Michaela says, the noun form is distress. So he levied distress, and the verb form is he distrained. So I'll put that in the chat for those of you who read better than you listen. So the verb form is distrain. The noun is distress. So what is distress in this context, right? What does that mean?
Does this mean he
You cut out, Michaela.
seized the property from him? Did he seize the property from him, like take it away, try to take it away?
Exactly, right? Distress is a common law remedy, okay, where a landlord can seize the goods of a tenant who's behind on rent. Okay, it's a common law remedy. Okay, so Walsh brings a claim for wrongful distress. And I mean, essentially this means, this means, hey man, you stole my stuff and you don't have permission to do that. Okay. So that's the idea, right? This is the claim is Lonsdale, you took my stuff and that's not okay. But I want to step back a little bit. I want to talk about the broader context. Here's why, okay? Your clients, when you are practicing lawyers, or just when you're out in the world, right, using your legal knowledge, if you decide not to go down the practice route, eventually someone's going to come to you and ask you to solve a problem. And some of the problem will be contained in the story that they tell you, but there will be a broader context that is going to affect how that problem might get solved. And you need to be able to be aware of that broader context and to draw it out of the client in order to sort of see the full scope of the problem they're asking you to solve. And here's the question that sort of bugs me about this case, and that I keep asking students, and we keep having this conversation, and that's just the structure of the tutorial. That's not any problem with you guys. Here's the question. This relationship goes on for a couple of years, no problems, right? Walsh is paying quarterly in arrears, everything's hunky-dory, you know, they're not really concerned about the lack of a deed. And then suddenly Lonsdale comes in and blows the whole thing up by demanding a year's rent in advance. Why would he do that? What would change to cause him to suddenly want to blow this up? And let me be clear about this. This question is asking you to get in the head of someone who's been dead for over 100 years. Okay? Right. That's one possibility, Maisha, right? Absolutely. It's absolutely reasonable to think that, you know, he had a debt get called in, or he had a cash flow issue elsewhere in his business interests, and he couldn't wait the 9 months for this payment. But what if there's something about the relationship between Walsh and Lonsdale that suggests that that's the reason that he changed that he made this demand, that he blew up the relationship? What might be going on in this relationship that would lead Lonsdale to change his approach? Go ahead, Maisha.
Yes, good morning. I
Good
was
morning.
thinking maybe perhaps, Lonsdale saw that Walt was making excess or this amount of money, and he could pay more money.
So you think that maybe Walsh is making, Walsh is making a killing, and Lonsdale's trying to get a piece of the action.
Yeah, basically.
Maybe. But he still would have gotten his quarterly payments, and the quarterly payments would have satisfied, like, the only difference between the quarterly payments and the yearly payments is the schedule. The amount is the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So he's entitled to the same amount of money. It's just a question of when he gets it.
Yeah. That one doesn't really make much sense.
So I'm not sure that explains what's going on. But I think it's a good first attempt, right? So what else might be going on in the relationship that would lead Lonsdale to change his approach?
I don't know.
Well, I mean, let's open this up to the rest of the group, right? What do we think?
Good morning.
Good morning, Johnny.
If I was on there, I observe.
I'm gonna stop you right here, Johnny. I can't understand what you're saying. Can you maybe get closer to your microphone?
Morning. Hello?
I'm still not understanding you, buddy. Maybe try it in chat. And I'm sorry to say that. I know that chat is slow. And believe me, I much prefer when you guys talk than when you are in chat. Okay, that works too. Okay. So we'll take just a minute break while Johnny sorts out his internet, and then we'll see if he's got anything back. And you guys can keep thinking on on the question. And just as a reminder, the question is, what might have changed about the relationship between Walsh and Lonsdale that would cause Lonsdale to blow up the relationship between them?
Hello?
Let's give it another go, Johnny.
Yes, good morning. If I saw that the business environment is changing and that he is in a position not to pay the quality payment, then I may tell myself he really need to get all his money in as soon as possible and calling years rent.
I got to be honest with you, Johnny. It's not your fault. It's my fault. Okay, but it's the combination of some problems with your connection and the fact that I'm struggling to understand. I'm still struggling to understand Caribbean accents, and that's not your fault. That's my fault. But I'm still not understanding what you're saying. So, Maisha, let's hear from you, and then we'll give folks another shot.
No, I was going to repeat what Johnny said in the event that you can understand me.
Thank
clearly.
you. I was hoping someone would jump in and do that. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Yes, he was saying that perhaps the business environment changed and he would have seen that Walsh would not have been able to make the quarterly payments.
That's
So
exactly what I'm thinking, right? So, Maisha, thank you for helping us out.
No problem.
Johnny, thank you for having this idea. That's exactly right? So let's think about how the cotton industry is working in the late 1870s, early 1880s, right? So there's a lot of supply disruptions in the time period sort of immediately before all of this. So we have the American Civil War in the early 1860s that essentially removes American cotton from the market. And then Reconstruction, where the availability of agricultural labor in the United States is a little all over the place because the folks that were agricultural laborers are engaged in other trades. And then unfortunately at the end of Reconstruction, we sort of have the development of Jim Crow that drags a lot of those folks back onto the fields. And then we have, there's Egyptian cotton and there's Indian cotton, but those present other challenges, particularly Indian cotton because of the monopoly of the East India Trading Company. And, sort of the problems, there may be problems with price. The other thing is, this is a time period when unions are growing in English textile mills, right? It's about 20 years after the big Lancashire textile strikes that broke the owners as resisting unions. And so labor costs are increasing as unions become more militant. We're starting to see the rise of labor as a political party in English politics. And so, yeah, Johnny, I think you're right. I think that Lonsdale looks at the broader context and he thinks Walsh is going to go out of business fairly soon. Like he's not going to be able to continue to operate this mill. So I need to get in and get the money that I can get while the getting is good. I have this contractual agreement. I have the right to demand a year's rent payment in advance. I'm going to do that. And if I can't get cash, I can get the goods and I can convert them into cash, right? So this I think is Lonsdale's reasoning. And so one of the reasons that I want you to talk about this, right, to think about this, is for Walsh, this is bet the company litigation, right? If he loses this case, if he doesn't get his goods back from Lonsdale, he is probably done. Because he probably doesn't have the cash to replace those goods until he can sell them. So you see now like why the context matters, because it helps you understand the stakes and the incentives for the parties, right? Okay. So we have come up to the courthouse door. We've stepped back and taken the more global look at how the case comes into being. Now let's go into the courthouse. And Michaela, I stopped you from telling us what Walsh argued, but now is the time. So what did Walsh argue?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Let's go.
Okay, so the claimant argued that under the common law rules, a lease had to be created by deed to be legal. This had not been done, and therefore the lease was illegal.
Right. Specifically, leases of longer than 3 years require a deed. Right. That's under the statute of frauds of 1535. Okay. Let's pause for just a second and ask ourselves, why do you think Parliament would require that leases of over a certain length be executed via deed, while shorter leases can be executed via, just a written agreement, or even just an oral agreement, right? Potentially. So what's special about these long leases that Parliament wants greater formality for them? What do you think? And there's not really a wrong answer to this question. There really isn't. So take a stab at it. Let's hear some half-baked wild ideas.
Right, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because,
you sound so much better.
Because these longer deeds have a more heavier impact on the situation where equity is concerned, that a more stronger contractual agreement must be put in place than a short leash.
Well, I'm not sure that equity plays a role here, because these are legal interests, right? But I think you're onto something, that the greater formality is intended to provide, better understanding of the rights of the participants, right? Specifically, I think this is about making sure people don't forget what is and isn't the rights to property, right? So I think that, I think the argument is that long leases are more likely to introduce complications where someone may not know what their rights in the property are. And so the deed is intended to make sure that there's a record, right, that can be relied upon. That's what I think. Again, getting into the head of Parliament in 1535, maybe not the most fruitful way to spend our time, but we just spent a couple of minutes on it, right? Yeah, I mean, the longer you're in a place, the more it feels like it belongs to you. I think that's absolutely right. And then, to suddenly find out that no, you're actually just a tenant and you're going to be dispossessed. Maybe we want some formality attached to that, to attach to that relationship. So, okay. So Walsh argues that he doesn't have a 7-year lease. Okay, that they didn't go through the formalities to execute the lease appropriately, right? But if Walsh has nothing, that means he's a trespasser and he has no rights, right? There's no such thing as a wrongful distress in that situation. So what does Walsh argue he has as an interest in land to justify his presence? Key. But a key only comes with some sort of legal interest in land, right? So there's got to be something actually, there's got to be something attached to it. Well, I would suggest that you spend some time reading, because now you're guessing when you say a license, right? This is what Walsh said he had. That's something you can find in the various texts that talk about the case. I promise, because that's where I found it. See, you're guessing again, and I promise you, like if you go and look at the Wikipedia article, it will tell you. Well, I guess I should double check that because it's been a couple of days since I looked at it, and Lord knows some vandal might have edited it. Okay, somebody edited it. Let me see. Okay, this is not, okay. I'm sorry, somebody edited the Wikipedia article. So let me just give you, rather than playing hide the ball, let me just give you the answer, right? Walsh argues that he has a year-to-year tenancy. So he's got a tenancy that goes on for a year, and at the end of the year, the parties decide, do they want to extend it for another year, right? The problem for Lonsdale, if it's a year-to-year tenancy, is that he could give Walsh 6 months notice and that would end the tenancy, even if it ends it early before the end of the year. And so by demanding a year's rent in advance, like with a year-to-year tenancy, if Lonsdale had the right to demand a year's payment in advance, he could come in January, demand a year's payment in advance, and then come in February and say, in 6 months, I want you gone. And that would all be perfectly lawful, right? So now I understand why you guys are guessing, and I get a better, I see now why. So what do you mean by vice versa, Maisha?
I meant you said that Lonsdale could have gone in 6 months and tell Walsh that give Walsh 6 months notice that he wants him out. But the same applies to Walsh as well. He could have given 6 months notice that he's leaving.
Right, right. So this is a better deal for, like, this this theory of the interest in land is better for Walsh all around because it saves him from having to pay a year's rent all at once. It, you know, it allows him the flexibility to shut things down in on 6 months notice when he runs out of money. And it lets him keep going because he gets his goods back because Lonsdale doesn't have the power to levy distress, right? So this theory is really good for Walsh, okay? But what does the court conclude? That is the equitable maxim that that the court uses. Who wins? Does Walsh win or does Lonsdale win?
The defendant, the court.
Right. Lonsdale
Which
wins.
is Lonsdale, yeah.
Right. Lonsdale wins. So I want to be very clear, right? The language in the judgment, the language in Professor Owusu's text, the language, Professor Cotolini doesn't spend a lot of time on Walsh versus Lonsdale. The other treatises that you can get at the bookshop, right? Maudsley and Burns, Gray and Gray, McGarry and Wade. None of them are as clear as I would like them to be about the logic of the court in explaining why Lonsdale wins. So let me see if I can give you some clarity here, right? The court says, look, you have this agreement, you have this contract. In that contract, you guys agreed to create this legal interest in land where you would execute a deed for this lease. You didn't do that. We, the court, have the power to order you to do it. Okay, we could send you back to go and execute the deed, and then Lonsdale would have the right to levy distress. But why don't we just skip that step and treat you as if you had done it? Okay. So this is the logic of the court. Does it make sense to you? Do you understand the reason? I'm not asking you whether you agree with it, whether you think the court got it right. Do you understand the logic that the court is using here? It's okay to say no. Okay. Maisha says yes. Johnny says yes. Other folks? Yes, no, maybe?
I just wanted to clarify. So essentially, the court is treating both Lonsdale and Walsh as if they had a written deed.
As if they had executed the deed that they promised to execute. Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
All right.
And so, but because of that, Lonsdale is treated as a landlord who has the rights of a landlord to levy distress. And Walsh is treated as a tenant who cannot be dispossessed until his 7 years tenancy has run. So I'm sure that's a great comfort to Walsh as he sits in debtor's prison. So Riandra, what's you say maybe, what's confusing? Okay, great, awesome. All right. Let me change things up just a little bit. We're going to say that everything's the same, right? Same contract, same agreement for a deed, same ongoing relationship, quarterly payments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But instead of Lonsdale being the person who demands a year's rent, what if Lonsdale sells the piece of property and let's just say that he sells it to his son, right? Just so that we can use the same name, right? He sells the property to his son, and Lonsdale Jr. shows up and demands a year's payment in advance. Who wins it? Who wins in that case?
Hi, sir. Can you repeat, please? I got a little distracted.
Sure. Instead of Lonsdale demanding the year's payment in advance, he sells the land to his son, Lonsdale Jr. And Lonsdale Jr. shows up and demands a year's rent payment in advance. Who wins? Okay, you guys think Walsh wins? Why? Go ahead, Maisha.
I would say Walsh because he never had any entered into any contract with the son. And I am not sure if that is something that runs with it.
So you're absolutely right that the lack of privity of contract is a problem for Lonsdale Jr., right? But who can avoid an equitable interest, right? It's equity's darling, right? The bona fide purchaser for value without notice, right? So is Lonsdale Jr. a bona fide purchaser for value? Absolutely. The question that this is going to turn on is, does he have notice of Walsh's interest? And I want to be clear, right? This is how complicated this case is. We're attempting to use the fact that Lonsdale Jr. is equity's darling to prevent him from exercising an equitable interest against Walsh, right? That's the argument, is that Lonsdale is protected from having to treat Walsh as a 7-year tenant, which means that he doesn't have the right to demand his money or distrain the goods, right? Do you see how that's a weird rhetorical approach to the case? But that's how the doctrine works. Okay. So I think that you have an argument, right, that Walsh wins, but the issue is whether he had notice, whether Lonsdale Jr. had notice. And if you can make an argument that Lonsdale Jr. did have notice, then he takes subject to Walsh's equitable lease, but he can still exercise the distraint and demand the year's rent payment. So does this make sense? Are we following this logic? Okay, Maisha says yes. But the property was legally owned by the father, right? The Lonsdale holds the fee simple, subject to Walsh's lease. So there's no question that the legal title passed properly. Okay. But I see your point that, if Lonsdale doesn't have legal title, how can he sell it? Right? But given that he executed the contract for the lease, you can assume that he holds legal title. Does that help, Johnny? Good. Okay. Last wrinkle, and then we'll call it a day, and we may exit a couple minutes early. Let's say that instead of selling the property to his son, Lonsdale drops dead, and the son inherits. Who wins in that case? Nothing else changes. It's just that the son has inherited rather than buying the land. Walsh or Lonsdale Jr., who wins? Who be treated as having notice? I mean, I think there's still a fair question as to whether he has notice or not. Well, if the tenant remains until the agreement is up, right, then that means that Lonsdale wins because he has the right to demand the year's payment. He has the right to distrain, right? So that's Lonsdale winning. Do we think that Lonsdale wins if he inherited? Let me ask this question that may sort of make it clear. If Lonsdale inherited, when did he purchase the property? Maisha gets it. Michaela gets it, right? He didn't. So if he didn't purchase the property, how can he be a bona fide purchaser for value without notice? Exactly. Okay. Great job, guys. I really appreciate you, your work and your engagement. And we will see you this afternoon. So we'll see you this afternoon when we will continue the conversation, and I will talk to you later. Take care.